I completely understand the reaction of people saying, you're an idiot for humanizing the Taliban. You are not an idiot for humanizing the Taliban.
No.
What they're missing is what a person actually is.
I think Islam hates us.
They have done nothing except wreak havoc and terror for our faith and our religion.
Professed values of the Western countries, democracy and constitutional and human rights, at least they should speak about this.
And it's like, I feel like religion just is making it worse. They say they believe in God, but I think they're just anxious.
Before we talk about politics, let's look at the fundamental things.
That we, when we stand up to those who oppress our communities, that Allah accepts from us that as a form of jihad.
And it requires people with guts to follow God in an era that everyone does whatever is right in their eyes.
Will you distance yourself from those who think differently? Or will you join us at the table and talk about what is really important? This is the Al-maidah initiative, conversation without compromise.
Last time we talked, you had just gotten out of Afghanistan and were in Pakistan. And now you are here in the flesh, safe in the US, and that's exciting for me. So welcome.
Thank you so much. And I agree. It's exciting for me as well because we first talked in 2020. So it's been a little over 3 years because I think we talked in March of 2023. And then the second time, you're right, was right after I left the country. And then I didn't think that the third one was going to be in person. So it's really nice to meet you in person, and I'm really excited for this episode.
Yeah, I was pretty sure the third one would be in person. We just needed you to get out. So part one, because this is now a trilogy, it's very exciting. Part one was kind of your life in Afghanistan and you being nominated for a Nobel Prize and your education and navigating the future of Afghan society. Then super fresh last time we talked, you just escaped. Kabul had just been taken over by the Taliban, and now we're 2 years later after the Taliban took over Kabul, basically, pretty close to that, and now you're here. So this episode is life after Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So what have you been up to? So take us through everything, the snapshot of everything you've been doing since you've escaped.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. So if I remember correctly, and I think I do, the last time we talked, I had left Kabul just, we talked after a few days after I had left the country, so it hadn't been that long. I remained in Pakistan for a little over 4 months, actually, because my sister and I were working on my mom and my brother's resettlement process because we had to get them out of Afghanistan, and they finally got their visas for Germany, but they had needed somebody to stay with them and to figure out all of that because this was a very new thing to all of us, and the process was too complicated. The visa process was time-taking. And so I stayed in Pakistan for about 4 months. I ended up taking another semester of leave of absence from college, so that makes it 3. I never intended to take 3 semesters of leave of absence, but the situation sort of required it. And so after that, after my mom and my brother got their visas, they went to Germany, and I managed to go back to Singapore. I went to Singapore. I had another 4 semesters at that point, and so I just focused on classes. The place that I was working with, I continued to work with them remotely. I was working with another place in Singapore. I continued with that too. I slowly started to train for my cycling competitions as well. I had a competition in Switzerland actually last year. I didn't have the best space for it to train, but it was a start, and it was great to see that all of the Afghan cyclists had also been evacuated from the country. So I went for that, and I actually just graduated from college this May. And so, yeah, it's exciting. A lot has happened, I feel, in the last 2 years.
Well, congratulations on your graduation.
Thank you.
So there's this movie called, talking about your mother and brother's paperwork. There's this movie that came out early this year called The Covenant. It's about an American soldier who is rescued by his Afghan interpreter. Is the first half of the movie. And the second half of the movie is the American soldier going back to rescue his Afghan interpreter from the Taliban. But in the middle of the movie, there's this 15-minute scene of him trying to get through all the proper channels for getting refugee resettlement paperwork and dealing with USCIS. And I have never felt more seen by a movie, because they just have him on hold for 3 hours yelling at the phone.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. I think it really resonates with me, because at that point we were also trying just about everything. But thankfully they got out, and my mom has a good job now and my brother studies. So they're still not technically awaiting citizenship or residency in those places, but they're sort of in the middle of those processes.
Sure. Like once you're able to like work and live your life, it gets a lot better.
Absolutely.
And the whole citizenship thing is just like this sort of existential threat that's looming over you for the future, but it's not like something that impacts your day-to-day life too much at that point.
I feel like you're right. Yeah, in considering what happened in the country, I feel like once you get out, you are able to get access to the opportunities that you wish you'd get access to. So like you're also able to try a lot of things that you're restricted to try, at least under the current regime in Afghanistan.
Yeah. So speaking of impending, looming threats in the current regime in Afghanistan, so what's really interesting to me is if you go back to Afghanistan 2019, 2020, and what, say, the sort of ruling class is the wrong term, but sort of the people who are thinking through Afghanistan's future, who are the Afghan government. You look at your resume, you're athletic, you're academic, you've been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize as a teenager. You at that point are the future of Afghan society and a model citizen in their book. Fast forward to 2022, you are the exact opposite of what the current rulers of Afghanistan want. Not wearing a hijab, educated, having her own opinions, right? Like, it's a very different scenario now. So how have you processed that? How do you think about that?
That's a very good question, and I feel like in response, I just have so many different responses because there are so many layers to those narratives. And under the previous regime, you're right, I think there was a lot of hope. People who were my age, myself, we specifically focused on improving ourselves and by extension contributing to society in any way that we could, whether that was through sports, whether that was through music, through education or anything. But that's still necessarily not restricted.
Right, you're a singer as well, which is also
yes,
haram, according to the Taliban.
According to the Taliban, but my family has a pretty rich history in music. My grandfather established the first Afghan symphony orchestra, but the music was banned during the first Taliban regime, and then after that my uncle came back to Afghanistan, and he established Afghanistan's National Institute of Music, where students have been studying. They've been playing in some of the biggest halls around the world. They've gotten huge awards, and so they are also they've contributed a lot to the society and to the cultural and art scene in Afghanistan. But of course, it's in complete opposite to what the current regime believes in, or like they state to believe in. But I think that even the past 20 years, but for me, like specifically the past few years, that on the one hand, I had this idea of continuing to work for what I thought were important, but on the other hand, that of course did not necessarily restrict the conservatism and a lot of the other challenges that came because the country was in war for decades now. Some years it will be 5 decades. So I think on a daily basis we still had to deal with a lot of the, I don't want to say negativity necessarily, but sure, like that term is one of the terms that can also be used. So I think we consistently had to come up with strategies that would allow us to cope with in those situations. So I think that helped a little bit, but of course I had learned about the Taliban from my family and from my sisters and from my mom, and so it was just new because I never thought I would be in a situation where I would interact with the Taliban or be in the country when they're in power for a second time.
Sure. So even in the days where you are involved in Afghan culture, there's still this looming. The context for that is this was banned at some point. There are people around who don't like what we're doing right now, but the thing that changes is that you assume those people are in the past rather than currently going to be in power somewhere.
In some ways, yeah, in some ways. I think, yeah, like in some ways, you could also think that you would get those reactions because these sorts of things have been banned at some point in Afghanistan. But what I like to do is I like to look further down the history because it wasn't always like that. I feel like when I talk about culture and traditions and challenges within a culture, and when I think about Afghanistan, I don't necessarily say that. Like, these people culturally think that you shouldn't do music, you shouldn't cycle or anything, but it's because the culture has unfortunately been transformed into that. And so when I hear my mom speak about the time she was going to school and she was going to university, I feel like that Afghanistan is completely, I cannot even imagine it. I cannot believe that a place like that existed. She got a good education. Again, that does not necessarily mean that there weren't challenges, but yeah. I hope that answers the question to some extent.
Yeah. Did your mom grow up in Kabul?
She did grow up, and she actually was in another province, in Baghlan province, until she was in the 8th grade, and then I think that was right before the Russian invasion in Afghanistan, and so they had to move to Kabul slowly because they got displaced and their houses were taken. I think they lost about 14 members of their family in one night.
Yeah, because I know the cultural experience of Afghanistan is very varied. So I guess my question is it so your mom, who grows up in Kabul, goes through this crazy roller coaster, receiving a good education, everything's pretty open, then there's the Soviets, then the Taliban, then the Northern Alliance, and the Taliban again, then the US. If you're living in a village somewhere, do you think people might have maybe more like a slightly more static experience of Afghanistan than someone who lives in like a major center like Kabul?
Depends on what part of the country we're looking at. I recently watched this documentary where there are like a group of people who are asked, so do you know who's the president of Afghanistan? I think this documentary was filmed in 2020, and the person goes and says, Amanullah Khan, who was the king in the 1910s, I think, like until like a little over 10 years, if I'm not wrong. And so, yeah, I feel like for that population, you would say that the government does not necessarily affect their daily lives that much, but maybe to some extent still. But in the bigger cities and in some other villages, I think the lives have changed. Some state that it's for the better, many state that it's for the worse. I think it like really depends on the region and on the people that we speak to.
That makes sense. It is like on multiple occasions now, if you ask an American, do you know where Turkmenistan is? They'll say no. No one knows where Turkmenistan is. But the crazy thing is I meet like a significant amount of Afghans. They'll ask me, where's Turkmenistan? Like, next to Afghanistan. What? No, it's not.
Yeah.
And just look at a map, it's like,
it's right there.
Whoa!
Yeah.
So it's very easy for people to be in little cultural silos in some places, whereas somewhere like Kabul is going to get the full range of like everything.
Yeah.
Is going to feel every era very uniquely.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because I think Kabul and like some of the bigger cities for sure, where you're involved in things, like you go out, you are in the society. So whatever happens in the government, even if it like slightly affects what you do, it like affects your life in a parallel.
So I remember the first time we talked, it struck me how excited you were to be in Afghanistan and how excited you were for the future of Afghanistan. So how are you coping with that not being possible for you to live there right now?
Yeah, it breaks my heart. It it really does break my heart. I think I love Afghanistan a lot. I have a very deep connection and deep attachment to that country. I've grown up in that country. I've went to school there. I started my cycling, my music. I had a lot of friends, and I think one thing that was always very interesting to me was that despite everything that was happening in the country, at times there was like a collective hope for a better tomorrow. Specifically, I want to refer to the people that I was surrounded by, and to see that is completely gone, and there doesn't seem to be a light across the tunnel. It's very scary. It is heartbreaking. I don't think I've been able to process what has happened to this day. I don't think I have a good coping mechanism with the situation currently in the country. I try to help to the extent that I can. It just breaks my heart that even helping those that are in the country is getting more and more limited by the Taliban and by money in the country.
So how's that working? So why is that getting more limited? So if you want to send money into Afghanistan, like what are the obstacles to that right now?
A lot, actually. So there has been an economic collapse after the Taliban takeover in the country, and so because of that, people, if you specifically want to ask me about transferring money to the country, you send them money, they are not able to get more than $200 in a week. I would say that that's still like manageable, considering like the economy in the country and all that, but it's getting more and more challenging. And aside from that, if you try to help people and like offer online classes, internet and electricity have gotten way worse than it was before, because the current regime is not able to pay for it and is not able to manage it well, and so you're not able to get the students to get online. A lot of the people don't even have a laptop or an iPad to log in and study, and so in that way it's also really difficult to offer them classes, and that just breaks my heart again, because schools have been closed for girls specifically for 2 years now.
Yeah, that's crazy. So you're now, you were preparing to be the future of Afghanistan.
I hope.
And now, like, you can't live in Afghanistan. So do you have any sort of, like, what's your basic plan? Do you have a plan? Are you just trying to survive? Like, how are you thinking through all this?
I have a plan until the end of this year.
Okay.
I haven't thought further than that, because I usually go where good opportunities take me. I think I'm very grateful that I have the privilege of living a decent life abroad, and I've had the privilege of living a good life in the country as well. I think I have people in my life and in my family that have sacrificed a lot for us to live this life. My mom, my sisters, and I'm very, very grateful to that. And so considering all those, I'm still in Singapore until the end of this year, because I took 3 semesters of leave of absence. Although I am pretty much done with school, I am getting a liberal arts and sciences education, so I have some extra credits to clear at school. And so after I'm done here, I am currently attending the Yale Bioethics Institute, and after I'm done with that, I'm going back to Singapore to finish those extra credits, and then I am applying for grad school and for jobs at the same time. And if I get any offers, I'll see which one's a good one and probably just go where opportunity takes me, I guess.
Yeah. Which I think is a lot of the position people are in right now.
Yeah.
Like while your situation is different than a lot of Afghans who say go to Pakistan, then to Brazil, then come up from South America, you do still have the same basic problem, is that you're functionally stateless at this point. Mm-hmm. So you've got to find a way of finding a long-term place to live, and that in itself is a huge challenge on an Afghan passport, to find ways to do that right now.
Yeah, I think even when I was in Afghanistan, I would not necessarily think about like where I would stay for the long run, because my plan was to study abroad, to work abroad, get enough experience. I was always going to Afghanistan to work whenever I had a break, but I think I'd never really thought it under like this context, where you don't have a place to go anymore. You can't go to that country, because I think at the back of my head, subconsciously, I always thought that, oh, I have a home, I can go whenever I want. And so that is not there anymore. And you're right, I think it's challenging. It is hard to think about, but we'll see what happens. And it is actually much more difficult with an Afghan passport. I already told you the story when behind the camera, but when I was coming here from New York, I was put on an extra 3 hours of security check, where they checked me if I even had explosives inside my body and under my skin. And it's frustrating and it's heartbreaking, and I'm sure I'm not the only one.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
That's definitely a common experience at airports. Although, yeah, New York is definitely the worst one, I think. Usually domestic flights is not too much extra questioning, but New York is just a level beyond that.
Yeah, I think my international flight coming into New York was a lot easier than my domestic flight, but I know hundreds of people are dealing and going through this experience. I'm just sorry for all of those people, because they did nothing to deserve that.
Yeah. We thought that was happening to us when we went to New York. So we went through the airport security, and then, they pulled us aside afterwards. And I assumed it was because I was with the Turkish guy and the Pakistani guy.
Yeah.
But I'd left my AirPods in my pocket, and they picked it up on the scanner. It was my fault that time.
But yeah, I feel like it's a bit too much of unnecessarily trouble to get people into. I can see why. I can see what the reasoning is behind it, but it's just sad that so many are going through that.
Yeah.
I'm glad it was just the AirPods, though.
Yeah. There's most airports in the world. It's like China was even worse.
What happened?
So we got out okay, but we're going through airport security in China, and there's like a 48-hour visitor line, and it's moving super slowly. But when we arrive, there's a guy at another desk yelling at someone in English, saying, "You've been denied entry to China before, and I don't want to ever see you at this airport ever again. Get out!" And then
what?
In our line, there's this old guy who's just very, very slowly doing everything, and the line's getting longer and longer and longer. And then the young angry guy starts coming through the line, says, "Show me your itinerary." It's like, 10 hours? That's too short. You have to stay in the airport. 12 hours? That's too short. You have to stay in the airport. People in front of us, 14 hours? Too short. You have to stay in the airport. Then he gets to us, looks at our itinerary and says, "You're only here for 12 hours? This isn't enough time to come to China, but I want the baby to be able to rest. You can come in." So having the baby saved us and got us into the country for 12 hours, but most people had a terrible airport experience that day.
Yeah. It's so sad that these sorts of things happening in the airports are like not surprising that much anymore.
Well, for me, I feel like when I'm going to China, I'm visiting a dictatorship. I expect a totalitarian dictatorship to treat people like that way at the airport. Bugs me in America because they're supposed to be the land of the free. And the airport doesn't feel very free when they're, like, again, I understand the need for security, but it's just a little unnecessarily extra.
Yeah, I think it also heavily depends on where you come from. When I came into New York City, arrived from Singapore, what I observed at the airport was all of these writings, and they're like, "Welcome to the U.S. where everybody is welcome," and all that. And I go to get an immigration stamp on my passport that I entered the U.S. and I get 100,000 questions about, well, why am I there? What am I doing? What I'm leaving? And then after, because that was my Afghan passport, and then the moment the person asked me where I live, and I said Singapore, and he's like, "Oh, okay, go ahead."
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Well, once you move here and get some American ID, you don't need to fly with your passport anymore. Just go with your ID and tell them you're Mexican.
I don't know. I think there was a point in my life where I always thought, I love my Afghan passport, I love my Afghan identity, I would want to stick to it. But now, experiences like the one I had just about 2 days ago sometimes remind me of how much limited I am because of holding a specific ID, which is very sad because I love Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you do need to hold on to it.
Yeah.
So the challenge ahead of you, which is a big challenge, but it's not an impossible one, is you've got to find a way to make a life somewhere that's not Afghanistan and hold on to as much as Afghan culture as you possibly can. Otherwise, they win. Like, if all the educated Afghans who are working for a better Afghanistan have to leave and they just forget who they are, then the Taliban will just continue to get to define what Afghanistan is for as long as they want to. But if you hold on to your Afghan identity and other Afghans hold on to their Afghan identity and their culture and don't forget the homeland, then there's always going to be hope for Afghanistan.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And I think that's what their win was 20 years ago when they first got into power, and all, maybe not all, but most of the people that were educated and were professionals, they left the country because there's no way they are able to live under the current regime. And I know a lot of qualified and very amazing people who still work under the Afghan government, like the current regime in Afghanistan. My apologies for saying the current Afghan government. And they have to make a living. So they work in that government. They are stuck in the country because they have no way out. But majority of the people that I know that are also out are all these incredible people that were working for the country. And so sometimes we just come together and talk about the work that we did in Afghanistan and just break our hearts all together. Yeah.
So out of all the Afghan, let's not use the term refugee because you're not a refugee.
No.
A correct term though would be an exile.
Yeah.
Right? You're an Afghan exile.
I think that's the closest it gets.
Yeah. So all the refugees would also be exiles, but not all exiles are refugees.
That's a good way to look at it.
So
yeah.
out of all the Afghan exiles, you immediately strike me as one of the more optimistic and upbeat Afghans
I get that
I've
a
met.
lot.
Like, is there something you're like holding on to that no one else is, or is it just a coping mechanism? What's going on there?
I think it's a little bit of both, actually. Yeah, it is a coping mechanism, and there's also a little bit of a genuine hope that I have for the betterment of Afghanistan. I think just because I grew up in a time where the country was developing at a really good pace, I would say, especially like there were so many people that were working in so many different areas in the country, just like wanting nothing but to contribute to the betterment of Afghanistan. And I know that I talk to all of those people, I talk to all of my friends currently, and one thing that we always say is that the day that we know there's no threat to our safety in Afghanistan, and I don't want to say a more liberal regime, but a better regime, let's say, rules over the country, we're back the next day. And that makes me happy to see that people are holding on to a sense of responsibility toward Afghanistan, and it makes me very happy. I have a hope for the country. I do believe that it's not going to remain the way it is forever. I just hope that there will be a smoother and faster transition to the better.
The question that I think about sometimes is Afghanistan is repeatedly called the graveyard of empires. So think of the Alexander the Great, the Mongols, the Russians, the British, the Americans. No one has ever been able to hold Afghanistan for very long. So the question becomes, do the Taliban represent true Afghanistan as they'd like to think? Or are they simply another empire that will be defeated by Afghanistan?
I hope so. I hope it's the latter. I don't have a specific answer to that because I'm not a historian. I don't think I necessarily need to be a historian to answer to that question, but I think Afghanistan is a very complex geography, and the history is very long and complicated. So I don't think there's one simple answer to that question, but I don't want to entirely dehumanize the Taliban because
Sure.
I think that is also a very interesting debate and conversation, but I do hope that what I hoped for, like, since they took over Afghanistan, was that them being absorbed into what Afghanistan had become and what these, for me, Afghanistan is not just Kabul. Afghanistan is much more complex than that, but to be able to fit in the society instead of restricting people to live according to their values. So I hope that I don't want to say the Taliban because, like I said, I don't want to dehumanize them entirely, but I hope that that ideology is one that will fall eventually. I pray for that day.
For sure. And I think there's like any ideology like that about sort of strict purity and zeal is very difficult for it to last indefinitely because there's two problems. The people at the top, the people who are the sort of zealous revolutionary leaders, now have to actually do some actual governing, which means they have to get a little more pragmatic than like somebody with a gun in a cave who is calling for the overthrow of the Afghan government and the establishment of an Islamic State. While that's a very impressive thing to do, to live in a cave that way, it's a very simple thing to do. It's difficult, but it's simple. You just hang in there and you fight. Ruling a country is not a simple thing to do. So there's, it's mine, don't worry. So ruling a country is not a simple thing to do. So they are not going to be in a position where they can continue being married to this purist idea of how they do things, which is going to be dangerous for them because the people under them are going to be those type of people who are sort of no compromise. We just got to do everything perfectly Islamically all the time. And so when those original leaders start having to make practical choices, then the leaders under them are kind of like hunting for their jobs. But inevitably, some people are going to like see this and they're going to understand that, okay, well, no, you've got to make some difficult choices if you want to lead a country. And people get tired of the purists very quickly. Both the people above them, who used to be them, and the people below them who have to live under them. So basically what you'll get probably at some point is this tyrannical middle management in Afghanistan who really, really believes these things. And then you'll get the people above them who are a little calmer and think they're sort of young and stupid. And then the people below them who are sick of them as well. And then at some point, some people at the top and people at the bottom will start talking to each other and realize they have the same essential problem. Hopefully.
Yeah, I think that, I think the reason Afghanistan is in a big mess right now, those are some of the reasons. And it's just interesting how they have people lined up, those that wish to die. I read, and I think it was a New York Times article a few days ago where one of the Taliban members is interviewed and he's talking about how he is heartbroken that he didn't get the chance to explode himself. And he has been fighting in the front lines, and that did not satisfy him enough that he thought if he exploded himself, it would make him feel satisfied and it would make a lot of other, they would say Muslims, happy. But no, not Muslims, because that is, unfortunately, that is their idea. And it's just very interesting how they have people lined up in the 21st century to just be ready to die and be heartbroken when they don't get the chance to do that. It's just sad. And I think I also told you about like other stories when I was in Afghanistan and I interacted with the Taliban. I feel bad for them. They are, I spoke to one of them. He was probably a 14, 15-year-old kid, and he reminded me of my brother. Like, he could be just about anybody. It breaks my heart. I don't want to dehumanize them entirely. It's just heartbreaking, and you can tell that they are sick and tired of fighting like that and being taken advantage of.
Yeah, ultimately they are people.
Yeah.
People who are under the guise of a specific ideology, but there has to be a category that not everyone who is part of an ideology at one point is going to be part of that ideology forever.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you know this, but one of my podcast guests and a friend of mine now is the ex-wife of the head of all propaganda for ISIS.
Very interesting.
So, she left the ideology, cooperated with the US government and now lives a life in Dallas and comes to visit occasionally. So I think that's actually a very big theme of the Bible. Jesus says, Jesus tells us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us, because then you'll truly be sons of your Father in heaven, because God doesn't just give good gifts to good people. He gives good gifts to everybody. The most evil person on earth still receives kindness from God himself. And therefore, we're supposed to extend that kindness to others as well. Not to be pushovers, not to not stand up to evil, but seeing that every person is a mixture of good things and bad things. And not everyone in the previous government, not everyone who went to your university with you is entirely good. No one. And not any one person in the Taliban is entirely evil either. They're human beings who are made in the image of God with unique dignity, value, and worth. And they're also sinners, meaning that all the best things in the world and all the worst things in the world live in every one of us. There's a guy called Alexander Solzhenitsyn who wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago. And in that book, he is talking about communism. And he says, if anybody is reading this book expecting a political expose, shut this book right now. If only it was so simple. If only the evil in the world was the responsibility of some bad man out there somewhere, and all we had to do was find that person and arrest them and get rid of them. No, the line between good and evil runs down the middle of every single human heart. That's where our enemy lies.
Thank you for sharing that with me. I am yet to educate myself more about the Bible and Christianity. I'm a Muslim, but I love reading about other religions, and I love talking to people who are not in the same religion as me, because I think I learn so much from them every time I talk to them. But that is very interesting, and I think the conversation of good and evil is one that always fascinates me and baffles me, and it's just interesting. It can get really philosophical, but I think we all have our bigger conceptions of what's good and bad in the general sense. But I recently have been just reading a lot more about the concept of just doing no harm, and so I kind of stick to that in many ways when conversations come about what's good and what's bad and what's evil. But I think especially considering communities and networks like the Taliban or the ISIS, this conversation can get really interesting and complex at the same time.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So do you know who Wernher von Braun is? He was the guy that sent America to space, right? He's the guy that designed the Saturn V rocket.
I feel very arrogant. Thank you.
And he has a very interesting story, because there's something called Operation Paperclip. And in Operation Paperclip, a lot of basically the Americans and the Russians were competing for Nazi scientists who were competent engineers, basically, in order to develop new weapons. So Wernher von Braun developed something called the V2 rocket. And the V2 rocket launched rockets from Germany and would bomb London and parts of Europe, and was doing a great deal of damage to the Allies. And worse than that, a lot of these rocket components were built from people who were concentration camps. But also Wernher von Braun did participate in that, but he also did go to jail for complaining that he's making too many weapons at one point as well. So he's not in the pocket of the ideology necessarily. But when he had a choice between America and the Soviet Union, he was not a Christian, but he said that he wanted to join America because they were trying to follow the Bible, whereas the Soviet Union didn't have that kind of morality. And to start with, he's treated with a lot of suspicion in America. Then he does become a Christian a couple years into that, really under the weight of the things he's been a part of, and looking for hope from God. And from there, while he starts in weapons for the US government, when the space race starts, they discover he has skills that will be able to take the US to space. So Werner von Braun goes from this enemy to this distrusted ally to someone who's the head of NASA and is basically an American hero. And like, no, people know what he was a part of before. They weren't hiding the fact he's from Nazi Germany. So the fact is that if there's a way for you to love your enemies, and if there's a way that you can extend a way back to people, it can make your civilization stronger than it is than if you just wipe everyone out. Which is why I think your attitude towards the Taliban of not wanting to dehumanize them is great. Because that means at some point in the future, you can help build an Afghanistan where someone who used to be part of that mindset isn't just condemned to a life of obscurity and pain because of what they've done. There's actually a mechanism forward that they can be repaired. They can actually have a purpose and a future in the world. Not just, okay, well, you suck, you need to be punished, you need to be gone.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story with me. I feel ignorant because I didn't know about him very much, but I have read a little bit about the historical period in which that happened. And yeah, I think you're totally right. And after all, what I tell myself at the end is always that they're your people. There are so many different contributing factors that lead those people into the arms of that ideology and the Taliban and the teenage kids who go there. And I don't think it's their choice for the most part, and I don't think a lot of people would do it intentionally if they had other options of surviving in a place like Afghanistan. But the fact that they do that also, I think, represents a lot of flaws and systematic problems within the country that need a lot of attention if Afghanistan gets a little bit better and when it gets better in the future. So yeah, I think you're right that I can see parallels within those stories for sure.
But it's really hard because, especially the Afghans who have had to leave, there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of people who have died, and it's difficult to have anything other than resentment to someone in that situation.
And it's valid. It's valid. I talk to people. I don't necessarily have the same idea as them. I think one time there was an interview in which I talked about not entirely dehumanizing the Taliban, and I had one of my best friends called me an idiot. And I didn't say anything to that because people are hurt, people are suffering, people have had their lives taken away from them. And they are supposed to be angry, they are supposed to be hurt, like they have to feel the pain, they have to process what happened. So yeah, I think you're right. There is that like very quick attitude toward the Taliban, but I think there's more to it than just an on the surface interpretation of the situation.
Yeah. So Ibaz, who you'll meet soon, his family in Afghanistan, there's none left now. Because when the Taliban went through his village, they cut off the left hand and right foot of every person in that village. And there's some, you can't shy away from the horrors that have been committed.
Yeah.
But it kind of leads to the question of, well, what is a person? And that is a thread we will pick up in the after show, which you can join us for right now.